Hi, I'm David Epstein. I'm a science writer and investigative reporter and the author of the New York Times bestsellers Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and The Sports Gene, Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. And today I want to talk about the development of human potential. And I want to start with what's probably been the most impactful modern story of development. It starts with this guy, Tiger Woods. His father famously gave him a putter when he was 7 months old. At 10 months, he started imitating his father's swing. At 2, you can go on YouTube and see him showing off his swing on national television. At 3, he starts saying, I'm going to be the world's next great golfer. He's famous as a teenager, and fast forward to the age of 21, he's the greatest golfer in the world. It's kind of that quintessential 10,000 hours story, right? Another that features in a number of best-selling books is that of the Polgar sisters. It's like the real-life Queen's Gambit. Laszlo Polgar, their father, decided to teach his 3 daughters chess in a highly technical manner, very narrowly specialized manner from an early age, and his goal was really to show that with a head start in so-called deliberate practice, this is very focused, not playing around, that any child could become a genius in anything. And in fact, 2 of his daughters went on to become grandmaster chess players. So when I became the science writer at Sports Illustrated magazine, I got curious. I thought, well, if this 10,000 hours rule, or what scientists call the deliberate practice framework, is correct, then we should see that athletes who go on to become elite spend more time and get a head start in so-called deliberate practice than lower level athletes. And sure enough, when scientists look at athletes, they see that elites spend more time in deliberate practice, no big surprise. But when they actually track athletes over the course of their development, the pattern looks like this. The future elites actually spend less time early on in deliberate practice than their peers who plateau at lower levels. They have what scientists call a sampling period, where they do a variety of physical activities. Sometimes it's other sports, sometimes it's martial arts, rock climbing, dance. They gain this breadth of general skills that scaffold later technical skills. They learn about their own interests and their own abilities, and they systematically delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. So that didn't comport with this sort of 10,000 hours thinking, and I was surprised. So I started to wonder about other domains that we associate with obligatory early specialization. And the next one that came to mind was music. And this is data from research at world-class music academies. And what I want to draw your attention to is this. The musicians deemed exceptional by their instructors didn't start spending more time in that deliberate practice than the musicians deemed average until their 3rd instrument. They too went through a sampling period where they tried some different things. They spent a lot of time in sort of more free-form activities that weren't as directed. But this research is kind of almost totally ignored, and much more impactful is the first page of the book Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, where the author recounts assigning her daughter violin and having her do 5-6 hours of deliberate practice a day. People don't seem to remember the part later in the book when the author says her daughter turns to her and says, "You picked it, not me," and quits. And so seeing this pattern again, I started to see it in other areas, like in higher education, where students who delayed picking a specialization ended up with a better fit, or what economists call match quality, better fit for their interests and abilities, and so had faster growth rates, even if they started out behind a little bit. And so I started to wonder about the developmental trajectories of people whose work I had most admired in my own life, like Duke Ellington, who actually shunned music lessons as a kid to focus on baseball and painting and drawing and only came back to music later. Or Mariam Mirzakhani, who dreamed of becoming a novelist, only to go on to become the first and so far only woman to win the Fields Medal, which is the most prestigious prize in the world in math. Or Vincent van Gogh, who had 5 different careers, each of which he deemed his true calling before flaming out spectacularly, nearing the age of 30, with no possessions and no accomplishments, picks up a book written for kids called The Guide to the ABCs of Drawing, and starts drawing the life he sees around him. That worked out okay, you've probably heard of him. Or Claude Shannon was an electrical engineer at the University of Michigan who was forced to take a philosophy course to fulfill a requirement, and in it he learned about a near century-old system of logic by which true and false statements could be coded with ones and zeros and solved like math problems. This had accomplished nothing except getting into philosophy courses for about 80 years. But Shannon then did an internship at a phone company and realized he could use relay switches, like those ones and zeros, and encode information into circuits. And that gave rise to binary code, upon which all of our digital computers rely today. And as Shannon said, it just so happened nobody was familiar with these 2 disparate areas at the same time. But finally, my own sort of role model, Frances Hasselbein, this is me with Frances. She took her first professional job at the age of 54, went on to become the CEO of the Girl Scouts, which she saved. She tripled minority membership. She added 130,000 volunteers. These are people she paid in a sense of mission, not in money. She turned the cookie business into $250 million a year, and she transformed the organization from one that was preparing girls for life in the home to one that was preparing them for careers in math and science. This is one of the badges that came out of her tenure. It's binary code for girls learning about computers. But we never really tell these stories, right? And by the way, Frances, today she works every weekday in Manhattan at a leadership institute, and she's only 105. So as she says, who knows what's next? We never hear these developmental stories, though, even though it turns out that research says they're the norm. Even when the work itself is really famous, right? We never hear about, say, the LinkedIn research on 500,000 members that found that the strongest predictor of who would go on to become an executive was the number of different job functions that someone had worked across. Or recent research by MIT and the US Census Bureau that found that the average age of a founder of a fast-growing tech startup on the day of founding was, guess, what do you take a second to guess and see what you think it is. 45. 45, right? We never hear these more winding developmental stories, even when the performer of the work is really famous. Now, for example, here's someone whose work I've followed for quite a long time. Here he is at age 6 wearing a Scottish rugby kit. Now, he played a whole bunch of different sports. Did some tennis, some wrestling, some skiing. Mother was a tennis coach but declined to coach him because he wouldn't return balls normally, right? Wasn't so into deliberate practice. He tried table tennis, basketball, swimming. When his coaches wanted to move him up to play with older boys, he declined because he just wanted to talk about pro wrestling with his friends after practice. And he kept sampling different sports. Soccer, handball, skateboarding, badminton, of course, rugby, etc., etc. And he wasn't focused on being the next great from an early age like Tiger Woods. In fact, when he became good enough to warrant an interview with his local newspaper, the reporter asked him if he ever became a pro, what would he buy with his first hypothetical paycheck? And the boy said a Mercedes, and his mother was aghast and asked the reporter if she could listen to the interview recording. And it turned out the boy had said mehr CDs in Swiss German. He just wanted more CDs, not a Mercedes. His mother was fine with that. Maybe with that hint, you can guess who this is. This is Roger Federer. Turned out okay. Every bit as famous as an adult as Tiger Woods, okay? But even tennis enthusiasts don't really know his developmental story, while everyone knows the Tiger story. Why is that? Well, I think for one, it's because the Tiger story is very dramatic. As my running buddy Malcolm Gladwell likes to say, it's like a human cat video going and seeing a 2-year-old golfing on national television. But I think it's also because it feels like this tidy narrative that we can extrapolate to anything that we want to be good at in our own lives. And I think that's actually an important mistake, because it turns out that in some ways, golf is kind of a uniquely horrible model of almost everything else that humans want to learn in the work world. Golf is the epitome of what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called a kind learning environment. A kind learning environment is one in which next steps and goals are clear, patterns repeat, rules are clear and never change, feedback is quick and accurate, work next year will look like work last year. Unfortunately for our ability to extrapolate from the Polgar experiment, chess is also a very kind learning environment. The grandmaster's advantage is based on knowledge of recurring patterns. So essentially you have to have started studying those by age 12, or your chance of reaching sort of one of the high status drops from about 1 in of international master status from about 1 in 4 to about 1 in 55. But that's also why it's relatively so easy to automate. So if you're in an area that is really amenable to this early hyper-specialization, you may not want to be there much longer, because there may be tools that do that work better. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is what Hogarth called wicked learning environments. Next steps and goals may not always be clear. Rules may not be clear, they may change. Patterns don't just repeat. Feedback may be delayed or inaccurate. Work next year won't look like work last year. So which of these sounds like the situation we're increasingly finding ourselves in? Now, some of both, but increasingly more of this. And that was true even before this very unusual last year, right? Over the last 60 years, the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company dropped from about 60 to about 15 years. We're in a faster changing work world. And our need to think relationally and keep track of interdisciplinary parts has actually fundamentally changed our perception at a basic level. So when you look at this diagram, the central circle on the right probably looks larger to you because your brain is drawn to the relationship of the parts in the whole. Right? Someone who has not been immersed in modern work, with its need for this relational and flexible thinking, would see correctly, by the way, that the central circles are actually the same size. So here we are in this wicked work world where we need to have adaptable thinking. And in that world, our intuition to be increasingly specialized and often therefore increasingly siloed can actually backfire really badly. So let's take a domain where this increasing specialization has been both inevitable and beneficial, no question about it, like medicine. No question about it, increasing specialization has been inevitable and beneficial in medicine. And yet, it's been a double-edged sword as some specialists get increasingly sort of siloed and only see a small part of the picture, such that 2 recent Harvard-led studies found that if you're checked into a teaching hospital on the dates of a national cardiology convention, when the most esteemed specialists are away, if you're checked in with certain cardiac conditions, you are less likely to die. And the researchers concluded that's because you're less likely to get certain procedures that some specialists have gotten used to doing over and over and over and over, even when independent evidence shows that they don't work or aren't indicated in a certain situation. So it's a double-edged sword, this increasing specialization, as some of the practitioners can become more and more siloed from the rest of their domain. Or I think, over the last year in the pandemic, we've kind of seen some of the rigidities of the healthcare system with some difficulty adapting because they are collections of siloed specialists in many cases. This is an editor's pick article from the journal of the largest association of hospital physicians in the world, Learning to Unspecialize in the COVID pandemic. And what it was talking about was about how when in a fast-changing environment, even having these incredibly bright and accomplished specialists, because they were often sort of cut off from the larger strategy pipeline of their work, were suddenly sidelined when things started changing. They couldn't adapt quickly with the organization because they were so sort of seeing such a small piece of the larger picture. And some organizations that I've been in touch with have actually started taking some of those specialists and re-embedding them with different teams of generalists and also just of peer specialists so that they could once again get a broader view of the pipeline of which they were a part. It was like a de-specializing exercise so that they could once again try to understand how their particular skills connected to the larger strategy of the whole organization. And sometimes this sort of re-embedding, which reminded me of something that a Navy admiral told me, he had to work at all the different levels of a ship before he was allowed to command it to understand the full pipeline. I think there's really good research. Some of these organizations, by the way, did it in person, and others did it using new technology tools to break down some of the silos between practitioners. I think there's really good research suggesting that's a good exercise for any organization, using technology to lower that friction and so that you can give people with specialized expertise a broader view of what their colleagues and organizations are doing on the strategy level. This is research. This is a diagram from research on networks of teams that give rise to creative performance. This particular network map shows a good network of teams that does give rise to creative performance. And you don't have to follow all these crazy twisting lines and everything. But what I want to draw your attention to is where you see like colors next to one another, those are repeat collaborations. So people who are working together again. And there's a ton of that. But there's also plenty of crisscrossing through the middle. And what that crisscrossing is people moving between teams regularly. Not frantically, but regularly. And what they're doing is taking knowledge that might be normal on one team and moving it somewhere else where suddenly it's seen as something new. And what's going on here, as one of the researchers called it, is an import-export business of ideas as people move between teams to leverage knowledge in the network. And that turns out to be like almost a universal signature of groups of teams that give rise to creative performance and success, whether it's groups that are producing Broadway plays or teams of physical scientists. If you see a network of teams that's only repeat collaborations or mostly repeat collaborations, that's not one that you probably want in this wicked work world where we have to be flexible and adaptable. It reminds me of an observation by engineer Bill Gore. So Bill Gore founded the company that created Gore-Tex, and he fashioned the company based on his observation that organizations often did their most impactful work in times of crisis because the disciplinary boundaries would go out the window And people would learn from their colleagues how they could help one another, what they could learn from one another, how they could connect to the larger strategy. Or as he liked to say, real work happens in the carpool, right? When there aren't those barriers. And I think the question for right now, because I think remote work is here to stay one way or another. And the question now is, where is that carpool, right? We don't have that carpool in the same way. So I think we have to be more thoughtful about creating it. And I think we can be more thoughtful about creating it, because while we may never have carpooling to the degree we once had, I think we have technological tools that we can apply to lower the friction between individuals and teams and organizations to get that import-export business of ideas moving more smoothly. But I think we have to be more thoughtful about it. I think we have to be more thoughtful about it. And if we are, I think the payoffs are enormous on an organizational and individual level. Because in addition to cultivating teams, and I know it's more of a challenge with remote teams, but more important than ever and more possible than ever with our tools, it also develops future leaders, individuals who can kind of see around the corner, so to speak. So I'm going to give you an example from a famous 20-year study of experts making predictions. The worst forecasters turned out to be the most specialized experts, people who'd spent their whole life studying one or two problems and came to see the whole world through sort of one lens or mental model. So kind of a funny offshoot of that research was had experts from 22 of the world's largest banks predicting currency exchange rates over a decade. Now the full study is 20 years, over 80,000 predictions, but in this study it was just a decade, experts at 22 of the largest banks predicting currency exchange over a decade. And as you can see, from the first to the second year, the actual exchange rate goes up, and it's outside the entire range of all 22 bank predictions. So it's outside the entire range again, and then it's outside the entire range again. And changes directions, outside the entire range again. Then it's in the range, but they follow it up, and it jumps outside the entire range. Then they get lucky once a decade, won't get lucky again, outside the entire range, in the range by one. And the conclusion of this research was that these specialist forecasts were useless because they were falling prey to certain cognitive biases that had them always chasing the recent past, essentially. And there were individuals who did better. Sometimes they had an area of specialty, sometimes they didn't. What was most important was not what they thought, but how they thought. As the researcher who led the work described them, he said, they have dragonfly eyes, these people who are good at seeing around the corner of economic, technological, and political trends. Dragonfly's eyes are made of thousands of different lenses, each one of which takes a separate picture, and those are then synthesized in the dragonfly's brain. And so what these people would do is they would go around to people with experience and expertise in other domains, collect their opinion. They would go to them for facts, really, not necessarily opinions, facts and approaches, collect those perspectives, and then synthesize them. Right? And so these were the kind of people who really wanted to be running their own import-export business of ideas in an organization so they could leverage all the knowledge around them. And they became the people who were the best at seeing around the corner. And so I think as we develop these remote teams, we need to think about fostering those people too, the perspective collectors, right? And again, this may not happen the same way just by serendipity of the carpool as it did in the past, but I think the opportunities to more thoughtfully and proactively and systematically create it are greater than ever because we have technological tools that can lower the friction that's often in that import-export business of ideas in an organization. That said, I think it's pretty clear to everyone now that a lot of important things happen that are simply unpredictable, right? So we have to be ready for that too and be flexible. And so how can we do that? How can we build so-called learning organizations, especially in the remote world? And I want to go back to my favorite person, Frances Hasselbein, and this is me with her. And when Frances took over the Girl Scouts, Frances had 1 semester of junior college education. Her predecessors had incredible credentials. One had been the head of the Women's Coast Guard Reserve, another university dean, etc. Frances, 1 semester of junior college education, and she came into an organization in crisis. And maybe because of just who she is, or maybe because of her lack of credentials, she was very aware that she couldn't just have the knowledge within herself to turn the organization around. That what she needed was to get that import-export business of ideas going very quickly across the organization so that she could get feedback about what was going wrong. And so what she did when she came in, the first thing she did was tear up kind of the hierarchical org chart and created what she called circular management, right? Where individuals were sort of like beads on these concentric rings. And importantly, she wanted everybody to have multiple contacts at adjacent levels of the organization through whom they could advance ideas and feedback to get this movement going again. What she was really doing, she didn't use these terms, but what researchers call this is differentiating the chain of communication from the chain of command. Differentiating the chain of communication from the chain of command. To get feedback flowing once again. She started getting lots of feedback from the ground, and that meant she realized that the organization had investments in things like campsites that nobody was using. They weren't targeting the markets they needed to recruit, so she tore up the old materials and created marketing materials specifically aimed at certain demographics. Again, tripled minority membership. But really, her fundamental insight was getting information flow moving in a way that was more vibrant than just the chain of command. So if the chain of communication and the chain of command are the same, then information moves too slowly to make impactful decisions in a wicked learning environment. By the way, if anyone's read War and Peace, one of the main points is that in Russia, the French army's chain of communication and chain of command were so similar that by the time Napoleon would give an order and it got down to the ground, it was irrelevant. And by the time the feedback about what happened got back up, he would make another irrelevant decision, just continuing the cycle of irrelevant decisions because the chain of communication and chain of command were the same. Another great example, I think, comes from an engineer, Wernher von Braun, who led the development of the Saturn V rocket, which first put humans on the moon. Now, the Saturn V was 60 feet larger than the Statue of Liberty, pedestal included. So even when teams were working on it physically at literally the same time, they were essentially remote from one another because they didn't know what one another were doing, even though their work impacted one another. So von Braun realized this need to differentiate the chain of communication from the chain of command, to have his teams that were remote from one another learning from one another. And his insight for how to do that was to bolster informal culture. And so he started what he called Monday morning notes. Now, Monday morning notes, every Monday morning, on one sheet of paper and one sheet only, he would have his engineering team leads put their salient issues, questions, findings, whatever. Occasionally they even put like personal stuff in it, but usually not. He would put in handwritten notes in the margin. He wanted to strengthen informal culture to make the chain of communication better. Handwritten notes about his thoughts in some of the margins, and recirculate all of them to everyone. Right, so here you can see one where he's saying to someone, hey, your conclusion, it seems that way to me too, but go see what this other person has to say, and then come back to me. He's being a dragonfly. He's soliciting disagreement, essentially. Here he's saying, someone brings up an issue and he's saying, look, let's put a pin in this. This is basically his way of signaling, hey, if any other teams, this is important. If other teams have expertise or thoughts that can weigh in on this, I'm putting a pin in this, so please do. And I like this one because if you look up at the top here, this is 2 days after the first humans landed on the moon. So this was just an essential part of their culture at all times. Here's another where someone brings up a finding that they think, they have some information that they think might be useful for someone else, and he's saying, please see to it that they get that. Right? He's connecting information across the organization. He's like acting as like a human data catalog, sort of. Here's a case where someone finds a major anomaly, and he says, congrats, because he wanted to be seen publicly by the people he worked with, congratulating someone for bringing up a problem before it had to come through a chain of command, right? Before it became a bigger problem for everyone. So this was part of his way of creating informal culture by letting people see his comments. The only thing he really didn't like was nothing of significance to report. If someone said that, if they had no knowledge to add to the network, basically. And I think what he was doing, it's obviously a crude way. He's handwriting in margins, but I think it's really relevant as we think about creating groups of remote teams. Because again, his teams were often remote from one another, even when they were working on the same rocket at the same time. And so if we want that import-export business of ideas, we need to think about differentiating chain of communication from chain of command, and how can we strengthen informal culture and use technological tools to lower the friction between information and communication among teams. And I think as the work world kind of spins faster and change comes faster and faster, our intuition is often to develop ourselves and our expertise sort of like this, right? Both because it's intuitive, but also it seems like it makes sense, right? You want to get a head start, know where you're going, go there right away. But I think in a winding work world, the weight of research suggests that the path we're going to travel looks like this, And so we need to think about developing organizations and people like this too. And now I don't want to, when I went through sort of the list of people whose work I most admire, I realize that can leave the impression of like, oh, well, go just do a bunch of random stuff, you know? But I don't want that to be a takeaway either, right? Because we know there are other important principles like grit. You've probably heard the term, quick refresher. It's a psychological construct based on a 12-question survey. Half the points are awarded for persistence of effort, perseverance, and the other half for consistency of interest. It's like not changing what you're interested in. And the work became famous with research at West Point, the United States Military Academy. The grit survey turned out to be a better predictor of who would make it through BEAST, which is this 6-week, very rigorous orientation process, than were more traditional measures like test scores and tests of athleticism and things like that. The grit survey also had some predictive value for who would graduate from West Point, as did more traditional measures, which is great. But the point of West Point is not to create BEAST survivors or even graduates. It's to create the future leaders of the organization, the future leaders of the U.S. Army in this case. And in that regard, each of these cadets, by the way, has a 5-year active duty service commitment after they graduate. In that regard, in terms of creating and retaining the future leaders, that hasn't gone quite as well recently. Starting in the 1990s, the retention of those very gritty cadets after their commitment, after their 5 years, looks about like this. About half of those gritty cadets quit almost on the day that they are allowed. And this trend popped up really quickly in the 1990s. And so high-ranking officers saw it and said, we got a millennial grit problem, right? Like too much avocado toast, not enough mortgages or something. I'm not sure what exactly the thinking is. But one high-ranking officer actually said, well, we're taking it way too easy on those millennials. We should defund Soft West Point. He said it's an institution that taught its cadets to get out of the Army. Pretty extreme. Probably not. Then a group of officers who were also scientists decided to study the problem. And they found that West Point had not, in fact, developed a grit problem overnight. They had developed a match quality problem. Let me explain. Now, West Point had a traditional up-or-out career structure, which worked quite well when the rest of the work world was like that. In much of the 20th century, we had a more industrial economy. People could have a discrete period of training followed by a discrete period of working. They didn't need to continually learn in quite the same way. They faced more repetitive, predictable challenges. And so specialization was often incredibly important and barriers to lateral mobility were higher. But then we enter the knowledge economy, the information economy, the creativity economy, and suddenly these young people who can engage in knowledge creation, creative problem solving, have incredible lateral mobility, right? They can move around a lot. And these young people, these high potential young people, are learning things about themselves in their late teens and early and mid 20s, and realizing that they have interests and strengths maybe they didn't know before, but they have no agency over using that information to match with careers in the Army, so they would just leave. At first, the Army didn't sort of recognize the problem and just tried to throw money retention bonuses. And those who were going to stay anyway took the money. Those who were going to leave left anyway. $500 million down the drain, didn't change retention at all. Then they started programs like one called talent-based branching, where instead of saying, here's your career path, go up or out, they'd pair these cadets with a coach-like mentor and say, hey, try this one career path. Reflect on how it fits you with your coach, with your coach or mentor. Keep track of those reflections in an online portal. Then try another, and maybe 2 others. And we'll triangulate a better fit. Interestingly, in the research on this process, many of the cadets were surprised at things they were good or bad at, often unpleasantly surprised sometimes, and also surprised at things they were interested in. 90% of cadets who went through talent-based branching changed their career preferences. 90% of them by having this sampling period. And this changed retention, where money bonuses had not. And so as one of the researchers who does this work described it to me, he said, when you get fit, it looks like grit. Meaning that if you get someone in work that has high match quality for them, fits their interests and abilities well, they will display the characteristics of grit, like persistence, retention, even if they didn't before. When you get fit, it looks like grit. And again, I think if the military is always going to have barriers to lateral mobility, but if they can create these sampling period for an internal talent market, then I think any organization that isn't is leaving a lot of advantage on the table. And I think, again, this is something where we can't maybe rely on serendipity. Maybe there was some of that in the past as there were office collisions with remote teams. We need to be more thoughtful about using technological tools to lower the barriers to this sort of sampling. And I think the tools, technology means we can be more systematic and thoughtful and proactive than ever. But we have to be systematic and thoughtful and proactive. We can't just rely on serendipity for this to happen. So what about once you do get someone in a place that fits them well? There's still advantages to sort of some of this roaming and breadth. I think there are. Let's start with in a creative medium, right? Comic books. In a fascinating study, 2 researchers wanted to examine what characteristics lead some comic book creators to be more likely to make blockbusters than others. And they thought maybe it would be years of experience in the field. That turned out not to be the case. They thought, okay, it'll be the resources of the publisher. That also turned out not to be the case. Well, okay, number of previous comics made for sure, right? No. The best predictor turned out to be the number of different genres that a creator had worked in. Crime, fantasy, nonfiction, you name it. The number of different genres, these individuals who had broad genre experience. And interestingly, broad individuals could not be entirely replaced by a platoon of genre specialists. So there was something about broad individuals that could merge knowledge in a way that could not be, that even though teams of genre specialists were better than individual genre specialists, you could not fully recreate broad individuals. But they just often looked like they were behind at first because they were moving between genres. So again, I think this is a challenge for building remote teams, is how do we lay fertile ground for these people, for people to accumulate this broader experience when in many cases they're sort of more on their own, working in their own area. How can we use tools to make sure to be more proactive and systematic about making sure they accumulate that breadth? Because this pattern sort of holds even in less subjective realms, like technology. So if you look at patent research, for much of the 20th century, the most impactful patents were authored by individuals and teams of individuals that drilled deeper into one area of technology as classified by the patent office. But fast forward to the information technology age, and suddenly information is disseminated a lot more rapidly, it's a lot more accessible, and suddenly it's a lot easier to be broader than just an area specialist. And now you start seeing the most impactful patents come from teams that include individuals that have worked in a large number of different technology classes and are often merging things from different areas for creation. Someone who is sort of on the front edge of this trend, whose work I've admired a lot, a Japanese man named Gunpei Yokoi, who didn't score well in his electronics exams at university, so had to settle for a low-tier job as a machine maintenance worker at a playing card company that made flower playing cards. Company was in total crisis, needed to diversify its business. And Yokoi wanted to help, but he realized he wasn't equipped to work on the cutting edge, basically. But he thought there was so much more information becoming available that there were opportunities maybe for him to combine things in ways that specialists were sort of too narrow to see. And one day he saw some bored commuters playing with calculators to kind of ease the boredom of their commute on a train and said, maybe I can give them something better. Right? He went out and he hunted down a customer need, so to speak. And he took some old technology from calculators and merged it with some old technology from credit card industry and created handheld games. And they were a hit. And it transformed this playing card company, which had been founded in a wooden storefront in the 19th century, into a toy and game operation. You may have heard of it. It's called Nintendo. And Gunpei Yokoi, the machine maintenance man, transformed it by combining old technologies. And the core of Nintendo's creative process became what translated to, and from Gunpei Yokoi's words, lateral thinking with withered technology. What he meant was taking technology that's already well understood, so accessible to a large number of people, combining it in new ways. And his magnum opus was this, the Game Boy. Technological joke in every way. Decade-old processor. Look at the screen. It looks like rotting lettuce, right? 4 grayscale colors that smeared across the screen. But he knew what his customers wanted wasn't necessarily color. There were two color competitors coming out at the exact same time, by the way. And one of Yokoi's colleagues came to him and said, oh, we're in big trouble. 2 competitors are coming out at the same time. And Gunpei said, are they color? And the man said, yes. And Yokoi said, well, then don't worry about it. Because he knew what the customers cared about was not color. It was durability, portability, affordability, game selection, right? And using this well-understood technology sort of drew game creators onto his team because they could quickly make games. And this is by the way, blew away the competition, became the best-selling console of the 20th century. This is my Game Boy that I found in my parents' basement when I was doing some research. As you can see, it's seen better days. But the red light is on, which is impressive. And I got to play a couple minutes of Tetris, which I thought was especially impressive because when I flipped it over, the batteries had expired in 2007 and 2013. So I want to share with you quickly just a couple descriptors from the work of a woman named Abby Griffin. And Griffin, in her work, she researches serial innovators. These are people who make repeated creative contributions to their organizations over and over and over. And I hope that these descriptions I pulled from her work of who these people are will be a little less surprising to you than they would have been 30 minutes ago. These people are systems thinkers. They have additional knowledge from peripheral domains. They repurpose things that are already available. They have an ability to connect disparate pieces of information in new ways. They synthesize information from many different sources. They appear to flit among ideas. Doesn't always sound like a compliment. They have a broad range of interests. They read more and more widely than their peers. They have a need to learn across multiple domains and a need to communicate with individuals with expertise outside of their own domains. Again, maybe we can't always create these people, but we can definitely ruin them. So I think the question is, how can we use our technological tools to create fertile ground, in a remote work environment to allow people who are inclined to develop this way to do so? I want to zoom out one more time from the individuals and talk about why some of this breadth in teams is advantageous. And I want to give you sort of a quiz to do that, okay? Here's your riddle. You're a doctor and I'm your patient. I have a malignant stomach tumor. And there's a new ray or focused radiation that can destroy the tumor if it's at sufficient intensity. The problem is, at that intensity, it also destroys healthy tissue that it passes through. So you can turn the intensity down, it won't destroy the healthy tissue, but it also won't destroy the tumor. So how can you save me? Okay, while you're thinking about that, quick story. There was once a country that needed to be liberated from a brutal dictator, and a general had to capture a fortress in the center of the country to do that. And he had plenty enough troops to do it. And there were roads he could travel, radiating out like spokes from the fortress. The problem was they were strewn with mines, and so if he marched his troops down any one, he'd suffer a lot of casualties. So he had the idea, split the troops into single file lines, synchronize watches, and everyone converge on the fortress at the same time. And they did that, seize the fortress, liberate the country. Okay, one more story while you're trying to save me. There was once a fire in a small town, and it was in danger of spreading to neighboring houses. Fortunately, it was near a lake. And so neighbors were coming and bailing water on the fire, but it wasn't working. So the fire chief shows up and she says, "Stop what you're doing. Everyone go to the lake, fill your bucket, get in a circle around the fire. On the count of 3, we'll all throw. 1, 2, 3, they throw the water, douses the fire. Fire chief gets a raise." Okay, have you saved me yet? Maybe you've had the idea at this point that you could arrange low intensity rays around the tumor so that they converge at the tumor without destroying healthy tissue. This is a very truncated version of a large body of research that shows when a team is facing a novel problem, something they haven't seen before, the number of solutions that they will come up with, and their chance of solving the problem, number of approaches and the chance of solving the problem, is predicted by the number and breadth of analogies to structurally similar problems that they can come up with. And what predicts that? The breadth of experiences in the team. And so it's another reason I think we need to have these broad, diverse teams in a remote world. And maybe that can feel difficult in some ways, but I think actually if we're thoughtful about it, it might be easier than ever if we use the right tools to lower the friction that exists between teams, if we wield our technology smartly. Let's zoom out just one more time to the greater work ecosystem, okay, to the work world and the future of work at large. Now this is a Newsweek cover from 1997, when IBM's Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov in chess, the brain's last stand, right? Like, I don't know why you all are going to work anymore. That was the brain's last stand, It was over 20 years ago. But this was when Kasparov, today a free app on your phone would beat Kasparov, as he will freely admit. But he noticed something unusual in the way the computers play. They were so good at tactics. That's those patterns that he'd had to study from childhood, that they could beat him. But they weren't as good at strategy. How do you arrange all the little battles to win the war? What's your strategy? And so he promoted what he called freestyle chess tournaments after this, where humans and computers could play in any combinations. Humans could play alone, computers can play alone, humans could play in teams, humans could play with computers, however they wanted. And the winners were not grandmasters. They were not supercomputers. Nor was it grandmasters with supercomputers. It was two amateur chess players with three normal laptops. They knew a little something about chess. They knew something about computer algorithms. And when the computers could take off the tactics part of the task, this became a totally different endeavor, where suddenly the people who succeeded had a totally different skill set. They didn't know chess that well, but they knew how to coach the computers and deal with streaming information. These human-computer partnerships were called centaurs, like half man, half chess beast. But in reality, they kind of look more like this, actually. But I think there's an important lesson here as we think about applying technology for the future of work. I think we should think about that kind, wicked work spectrum, right? When we think about how to liberate people to do what they were best at, this more open-ended strategic thinking, right? Where can we take away tasks from people that are sort of more repetitive in nature so that we can liberate them to be creative, adaptable, and strategic? Where can we create centaurs in our own organizations? And I think the ATM is an interesting example because I went back and looked at news coverage from the early 1970s when it first came online. And the news coverage is all like, this is a disaster. You know, bank tellers are going to go out of business overnight. And in fact, over the next 50 years, as there were more ATMs in the United States, there were more bank tellers. But partly because ATMs made each branch cheaper to operate. And so banks could open more branches with fewer tellers per branch. But it also fundamentally changed the job from one of repetitive cash transactions to one of someone who is a customer service representative, a marketing professional, a financial advisor, this much broader mix of strategic skills. Some people call maybe soft skills. I think it's a better term durable skills because they never go out of style. So this actually turned out, despite the news coverage at the time, to be a massive centaur success where technology was able to take away the things that it did better to liberate humans to do the strategic thinking, to connect to overall strategy in a way in which we're uniquely equipped. So that is, I think, a very important lesson for work in general, but especially with remote work. What tactical stuff can we take away from humans or make very quick so they can focus on connecting their work to the larger strategy? Now, finally, I want to make sure it's clear that I don't think we shouldn't have a specialist, obviously. What I think is that we need developmental pathways for the Rogers and the Tigers. I think the problem is we tend only to set things up and encourage this pathway. Or as the eminent physicist and mathematician Freeman Dyson said, if we want to have a healthy ecosystem, he's a wonderful writer too, if we want to have a healthy ecosystem, then we need both birds and frogs. Frogs are down in the mud, seeing all the granular details of problems. Birds are soaring up above. They're not seeing those granular details, but they are integrating the knowledge of the frogs. And the world is broad and deep, and so we need both. The problem, he said, is that increasingly we're telling everyone to become frogs. And I think for a wicked, dynamically changing work world, that is very short-sighted. Thank you very much for having me here.